And this chapter and these particular chapters are so powerful and they're so important. And in particular, because I've had the privilege of getting to sit with cups of coffee and hear your stories, I know that there are a few of us, maybe many of us, that have been on a journey, and we at some point found ourselves, after an enthusiastic involvement in our churches and religion when we were young, somewhere along the way we found ourselves broken from the darker side of religion and religious systems. And in that place, we just continued going through the motions while our soul kind of shriveled and went into hiding. And somewhere along the way, the Holy Spirit intercepted and invited us to go on a journey. And it was a journey that was going to restore our faith and bring healing to our souls. But at first, we have to wander through a desert. And in that desert, there's moments of joy, an oasis of delight, but there's also uncertainty. So we go on the journey, and then sometimes we feel liberated and we feel empowered, but then we also begin to get frightened because we're no longer surrounded by the familiar. So maybe we run back to the system for a little while to see how it fits, only to find it was a little more constricting than it was when we began to move in another direction. John 10 speaks very specifically to that journey that you're on. And so much so that I feel woefully inadequate to be leading a meditation on it, but I will do the best I can. And I will also admit that this preparation reminded me of my own journey. And so I just find John 10 to be very personally comforting and enlightening. And so I just pray that over the next few weeks as we wander through John 10, that we will just have an attitude of humility where we're just going to sit at the feet of Jesus and learn from the beauty and the wisdom that he offers and that he empowers us with. So we're going to look here at John 10, which is going to be about a contrast between the stranger's voice and the shepherd's voice. Now I want to speak to the context as we're listening, because of course what we're seeing historically take place is this grandest of conflicts. I mean, this conflict that we are reading about in John 10 literally altered the course of human history for believer and non-believer alike. And so, of course, we're looking at the context of first century Judaism, and we are looking at the context of the religious voices of the Pharisees, a group that, as a group in general, not as all individuals, because there are some individuals that had very healthy relationships with Jesus, but when they're addressed as a group, they typically represent the voices of resistance to Jesus and the voices of shepherds that have put burdens on people and stopped shepherding their hearts long ago. And so Jesus' message, his gospel, creates a contrast between these two sources of religious authority, one given by the recognition of an institution and the other given by the recognition of the Spirit of God. And this conflict, of course, will create a crescendo in which the voice of religious authority will then conspire with the voice of civil authority in order to bring about the execution and crucifixion of Jesus. So there's certainly that historical tension, and we can read it from that lens and learn lots of things about it. But I want to invite you to go just a little bit deeper, because this is the beauty of the Bible. And remember, what we've been looking at in John is is the misinterpretation that happens when disciples interpret Jesus' words and actions only literal. I won't go back listing all those because I've listed them multiple times, but just in our journey through John, it's happened on multiple occasions, and I've tried on those multiple occasions to point that out. Because that's their story, but it has our story application. We too can limit the wisdom of the Bible whenever we stay in the safety of only historical, literal interpretations. Because I think the Bible speaks to us at multiple levels. One of the levels it speaks to us that I would to encourage you about today is these two voices. That one of a rigid religious authority, and then the gospel, life-giving grace of Jesus. These voices exist in your own mind. You are the Pharisees, and you are Christ in you, the hope of glory. And you've got to be aware of how that conflict plays out in your own narrative, because lack of awareness will not rescue you from the consequences of it. So it's important that we create space to be aware of the multiple voices at any given time that are speaking to our hearts and to our minds. We might find that this journey and these choices that are before the actual literal historical crowd also exist in our hearts. But I hope you also begin to see there's another contrast going on both within the story and in the way that it applies to us. In fact, in the way that it applies to all humanity. You've seen this contrast between Jesus and the Pharisees. Hopefully, you are maybe awakening to the contrast of the voices of shame compared to the voice of tenderness that exists in your own soul. But I always want us to remember the holistic nature of the message of the Bible. What else do we see here? We see yet another illustration of a symbol that starts at the very beginning of the Hebrew Bible. Here you have in Jesus the embodiment of the tree of life that exists in the garden. And by contrast, you have in the embodiment of the Pharisees this outworking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Those two sets of voices have always been historically at odds. That's how the story begins, with that original conflict of those two realities. And so those two options are before you every single day when you wake up. Will you proceed with this next 24 hours being nourished by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Or will you proceed the next 24 hours being nourished by the tree of life, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory? Mystery hidden in the ages, revealed at the proper time. So think of those contextual realities as we read and interpret. And you guys are in trouble because I haven't started my speaker clock and I'm already, I don't know, however many minutes in. But I'm just going to claim those as my own. I'm not adjusting the speaker clock here. So there it is. So John 10, verses 1 through 6. Some voices demand attention with volume and force, but others, the ones that change us, are quiet, familiar, and true. And in John 10, Jesus shifts from confrontation to parable. The religious leaders have rejected the man born blind, and Jesus responds with a new image. Remember, the image we're leaving is when he has a direct confrontation, and he takes this image of blindness, and he reveals to the Pharisees, though you can see, you are blind, but you don't know you're blind, and this is your great sin and deception. And they're perplexed by being put in that category. Then he just shifts from that confrontation in this parable, and now we see a new image unfolding in his dialogue. A sheepfold, a shepherd, a stranger's voice, and a gate. These are the metaphorical images that we're working with now as we sit at the feet of Jesus. And most importantly, there's a question that echoes beneath the surface. Whose voice are we following? And how do we know? Whose voice are we following, and how do we know? John 10, 1 through 6. Verily, very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. Now, I'm sure this has application to our journeys of discipleship, but contextually, what he is contrasting are two different sources of spiritual knowledge, or one, spiritual knowledge and spiritual wisdom. He's talking about that he's contrasting the two different sets of what we might yield to as spiritual authoritative voices. Verse 2, the one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. If you're reading your Bible on a tablet, or if you've got that old-fashioned thing called books and paper, and you're prone to notations in your chosen medium, highlight or underline that phrase. They follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. He begins with this idea of entering the sheepfold rightly. I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who doesn't enter the sheep pen by the gate but climbs in by some other way, which says there is an illegitimate way of posing as a religious authority or a voice of authority. There is an illegitimate way and an illegitimate way. And those two voices have a different relationship to the sheep. Climbs in by some other way. It's a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. So he draws this contrast between those who enter by the gate and those who climb in by some other way. He is contrasting different kinds of spiritual authority, or we might say voices. There are other voices vying for our attention. The thief climbs over, bypassing care and bypassing consent. Again, this is nothing but a resetting of the imagery of the Garden of Eden that we're invited to live in, that exists right here in our own minds and hearts. Just like Adam and Eve, you awaken every morning in that garden, and you have a choice of which voice you're going to yield to. And either that voice is an echo of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or that voice is an echo of the tree of life. In fact, in ancient Christian theology, true spiritual leadership, frankly, is very, very different than what it has become in contemporary America. I've gone through the Bible training schools. I've listened to the podcasts that recommend the books. I've gone through the pragmatic conferences that essentially say, if you're small, you're failing, come to this conference and we'll teach you how to succeed. We'll help you grow your numbers from 200 to 300, 300 to 400. I don't know if you know this, but back in the 90s, these conferences existed. They were called Break the Barrier conferences. And if you were at 200, then you went to the conference that helped you get from 200 to 300. If you were at 300, you tried to get to the conference to get you from 300 to 500, and so on and so forth. My contention, I think the reason why we're seeing literally before us every day a breakdown of contemporary evangelicalism is because we replaced the pastor with the CEO. From the very beginning, that shift was dangerous. Pastors should be reading books by shepherds, not leadership gurus. And I'm not saying that there aren't transferable principles. I do know that my proclivity is to disdain systems to the point of cutting off my nose to spite my face, and people put gentle voices around me to remind me there is a balance, not to over-romanticize the ideal. But part of the reason is I see what has happened in the church because we've replaced shepherds with CEOs. And until that model is altered, we are not going to correct the constant stream of controversies and abuse of power that we read nearly every single week that are happening within evangelicalism. Sorry, I'm stepping off the soapbox now. But they're actually, unlike many of my other distractions, a point that I'm making here. Because in ancient Christian theology, true spiritual leadership is kenotic. I know that sounds like a fancy word. You probably don't know what it is. That's fine. I didn't either without the Google. But I thought I'd throw it in here and just throw it out there so I appeared like a very successful CEO-type pastor. And this word kenotic simply means self-emptying. It comes from a Greek word that we actually find in the Greek text. It comes from Philippians, where we read that Jesus modeled servant shepherding through humility and presence. It's found in Philippians 6 through 7. When speaking of Jesus, Paul writes, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. In other words, Jesus' authority doesn't come from his role, but from his presence. Verse 7, here's our word. Rather, he made himself nothing. This is kenosis right here. He made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And we too must ask, have we tried to enter God's presence by climbing over the wall through effort and performance and fear, instead of coming honestly through the gate, through the kind, non-performative grace of the suffering servant who is the only legitimate, life-giving gate? The only way that ultimately brings life. Both ways will buy you behavior modification. Both ways might lead you into tips for more successful living, but only one way is life-giving. The other one forces you to become inauthentic and to live a projected poser identity that will succeed for a while, but it will eat away at your soul like a cancer. It makes you a better Christian, but not a better human. And so we have to be aware of the contrast between those two ways. Then in verse 3 and 4, he introduces this idea of the shepherd's voice. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow because, and you've underlined this, they know his voice. Why do we know this voice, my friends? Because this is the voice that formed us. It's the voice that whispers our name, not to control, but to call, to invite, to beckon. Jesus does not coerce. He does not compete. He simply calls. And the sheep follow him because they recognize the voice that has always known them. Real leadership is not rooted in title or charisma, but in the recognition of love. The sheep follow simply because they're known. And now he introduces this idea, but there is a contrast between that voice. In this section, he simply calls it the stranger's voice. They will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. There are many voices today. Those voices all sound spiritual, but they are not Christ's. These are voices that use fear, performance, and shame. Voices that promise life, but they leave us depleted. The sheep don't follow the stranger because they've learned the tone of love. But if you're involved in toxic religion, it will condition you to misread the stranger's voice as that is love until you're in too deep and you're too sick to do anything about it. The question is not just which voices we hear, it's which voices we've grown used to. Have we become familiar with the voice of performance or pressure rather than presence? Are you more familiar with the voice of performance and pressure rather than simply presence and peace? Jesus doesn't argue, he tells a story. And in this story, we are invited even today to simply pause and listen. And the question that is before us, my friends, is do we know the difference between a stranger's voice and the voice of the shepherd? And don't be too quick to rush to an answer. I have learned that some of you are annoyed and alienated when I quote my favorite poets. And then there are some of you, I'm looking at you right now, I'm already feeling your judgment because you know I'm setting it up. But there are a few of you that have also expressed appreciation, and I'm the one with the microphone. So, I want to quote one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver. One day, you finally knew what you had to do, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. Deciding doesn't make the bad voices go away. You have to go on a journey of discernment. So, what are the obstacles to hearing, and how can we begin to listen again? Because, my friends, there is a moment, it's a holy moment, when the soul hears the voice of the shepherd again. It's called renewal, and we begin to follow. So many of us struggle, though, to hear that voice. And it's not because he is silent. It's simply because our inner landscape is cluttered. And I want to give full disclosure. This is one of those messages that feel a little uncomfortably egocentric, because I am preaching to the guy in the mirror here. I am preaching on stuff I'm traveling and struggling with, not things I've mastered at this point. So, I am fully aware of what it is to live with an inner landscape that is cluttered. The obstacles are often spiritual, emotional, but what I've learned in this leg of my journey is that they're also neurological. All at one time, they all blend together. And here are some most common reasons. Number one, noise saturation, both cultural and internal. We live in a world of notifications, constant notifications, competing ideologies, social comparison, and relentless urgency. Our inner life becomes crowded, and the subtle voice of Christ, which is rarely dramatic, often gets drowned out. What can we do? I don't know. You're dismissed. All I can do is offer you a moment where I'll bear witness to my own journey and some of the things that in this season have been very life-giving to me. So I highly recommend the practice of, and no one's going to be surprised by this, daily silence. Even if it's just beginning at 5 minutes. But I got to tell you, I'm kind of becoming addicted to it. And like most addictions, it's kind of, I'm in that place of diminishing returns, because 5 minutes doesn't quite scratch that existential itch anymore. I've had to rearrange my rhythms to work in more space for silence. Here's the point, though. The only rule is you can't have a goal. You're not doing it to become a better Christian. You're not even doing it to be able to hear the shepherd's voice better. You're just learning how to train your soul to return to the place where we can most clearly hear the voice of the shepherd, that is in silence. Simply be in God's presence. And if it's helpful, you doers out there who I'm about to lose, because the last thing that you can think makes any sense is taking time from doing and sit in silence. I hear you. Maybe I'm married to you. And it's a good thing I am, because I would never get anything done. I would just think deep thoughts about my non-productivity. But maybe here's something you can do. Listen to the wisdom of Samuel and just set your 5-minute timer, close your eyes and breathe and say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." I'm not saying anything of an epiphany will happen. Maybe not, but it might. But the primary thing that you're doing is learning how to train your soul to return to the silence in which your very being was crafted in the first place. It's part of who you are. It is what will nourish your journey. Number two, and I know this one sounds a little awkward, bear with me, the fear of being found. To hear the shepherd's voice is to allow ourselves to be known. And if being a professional Christian has taught me anything, is that in order to navigate the Christian world successfully, you better hide your authenticity and vulnerability. We pretend like we make space for it, but we all secretly know it's not true. So we get very adept at navigating our Christian communities and hiding our authenticity and vulnerability. It's one of the enemies that this community tries to be aware of so that we can resist and work around it. The truth is, though, to be known can be terrifying if we carry shame, trauma, or have been trained to earn love through performance. So what can you do? Well, admit it. And one of the things that I have found very helpful, and I took it out of the notes, it's called somatic awareness. It just means body, so I put in body awareness so I didn't sound, I don't know. I can't think of the word right now. Pretentious. And all it means is you pay attention to where your body is signaling stress and anxiety and fear. I thought this, frankly, was a little silly when I first heard it, but then I started practicing it. And it has been critical to my own personal journey of mental and spiritual health. It is just that you sit, and when the presence of those emotions come, take a moment and recognize, where do they land in your body? Because it's different from any of us. I work with lots of people, talk with lots of people. They feel it there in their neck or in their shoulders. I can tell you, I know when its ugly presence is with me because I feel the heat right between my shoulder blades. It took a little while for me to recognize, but now I know it immediately. And I know that I'm sitting in an anxious presence and I am in danger of listening to the wrong voice, of being coaxed by the stranger's voice. So I sit, I let that awareness rise to the surface. And this isn't a trick to get rid of it. Awareness is your only goal here. Name it. Here I am again, Lord. The fear, the anxiety is resting right between my shoulder blades. And then you just invite Christ to meet you there without needing to fix it. Just to name it opens the door to healing. And when you become aware, the Holy Spirit will use your willingness to speak to you even more dramatically, because we really are afraid of being known in our vulnerability. We've got to name it in order to grow out of it. Of course, I'll admit that maybe I was conditioned last night because I've been sitting with this all week and thinking about it and been quite moved from it. But one of the other things I've been doing in this season is paying attention to my dreams. Not for prophetic messages of what they're saying about other people, but for what they're revealing about me. And with these three things we're talking about, fearing to be known, and we're going to talk about the inner critic and the over-identification with roles, all of these blended to me very powerful last night. When I had this dream where we were living in a location that when we lived there, we faced some really, really difficult things. When we lived in that location, I began to finally lose my energy to hide myself, and one of the ugliest, most nasty versions of myself became manifested on a fairly consistent basis in that house. Not here. I was happy to be Brother Artie here, but I was tired of the posing and the roles. I just had enough energy to keep it up while I was in public. But at that house was a very different story. And if it wasn't for the intervention, frankly, of my dear wife and my dear friend Mike Carnahan, they conspired to rescue me. But in that dream, that's where I was living. And in the dream, my wife was gone, not gone forever. She was like at work or something. And my older two daughters had moved out of the house. The only one there was my youngest daughter, and she was at high school that day. And as I was sitting in the house, I felt this presence of danger. And I decided I'm going to get out, and I'm going to intercept Anna from the high school so she doesn't come home today. And I go to the parking lot before school's out. And then for some reason, I decide I'm going to go for a walk jog. But in order to prepare myself, I didn't have any athletic wear, so I just take off all my clothes down to my underwear. Out the truck I go, and I admit, look, it was very liberating at first. And I always wondered what it was like just to walk around in my underwear. And in the dream, I walk, and I'm just enjoying myself. And I get further away from the truck, and I hear the bell ring. And then it dawns on me, I don't think this is going to be acceptable. If school lets out and all the students starts coming out, somebody's going to say, there is a comfortably overweight, middle-aged man in his underwear in the parking lot, and they're probably going to call the police. And so I start to panic, and I look, and my truck is now miles away. You guys know these dreams. So I take off running as hard as I can, and I'm running to get to that truck before anybody sees me, and I just can't get there. And I wake up, and I sat in prayer this morning, thought through journals and other things, I realized this is just it. It's just, there's a vulnerability that we know could make us healthier, but we're so afraid of being seen. We are so conditioned to convince ourselves it's not okay to show our brokenness and our need for grace to other people. And we construct these cultural, social expectations that reinforce this ill health. My friends, if we are going to be a community of transformation, we need to start looking more like an AA meeting and less like a polished Sunday school meeting. There has to be space to hold the vulnerability of our imperfections and our brokenness, because that is the beginning of how we heal one another. But we want to hide this person not just from one another, but if you grew up with a God who's a harsh critic, you're hiding that person from your God. And you will never be whole until you come out of the shadows. So be aware of the voices. The third is the inner critic. The stranger's voice often masquerades as God's. It's demanding, it's shame-filled, it's impatient, and it's moralistic. And many of us were taught to associate God's voice with scolding, not love. Now, again, I'm not blaming anyone for this because my journey has been broad and over many years, but I just know that somewhere along the way, my assumption was if the voice was loving and comforting, I needed to resist it because it was probably the enemy getting ready to deceive me. Because if it was God, it had to be him constantly pointing out the imperfections that he alone could see so clearly. And I would wait for the voice of condemnation to manufacture an emotional moment that I called spiritual experience. And I did this over and over and over. It's a voice of the inner critic. So learn to ask, does this voice lead to love or to fear? Remember what John said, perfect love casts out fear. Name the tone of the voices that are driving you and invite the true shepherd to gently speak in their place. 4 is an over-identification with roles, which is, I guess, at some point this morning, I decided would be the appropriate place to share the dream. I shared it in preemptively because my notes say, dream about running in your underwear. And that was my cue to share that now. Because in that, I realized what the stripping in my truck was about was taking a moment of taking off the costume of my roles. That's what I wanted to do. I so desperately wanted to just be without my roles and all the responsibility and the posing that they require of me. And I wanted to be authentically and vulnerably me. We often define ourselves by our titles. For me, those are husband, parent, pastor, leader, good Christian. But the shepherd, and this is critical, my friends, the shepherd doesn't speak to roles, he speaks to the soul. So if you are so committed to identifying with your roles rather than your soul, you're going to miss his voice. Because he is not going to reinforce that false narrative of our identity idolatries. Because he's working to liberate us from those things. So the voice of the shepherd speaks not to roles, but to soul. When our sense of identity is fused with performance, we miss the intimacy of being addressed by name. Think about this, and I know I'm kind of running out of time because I'm watching my clock now, which I'm already on borrowed time. But that great story of Hagar, go back and read it. The first half of the story, she is related to only as a role, and her name is never mentioned. Then she runs away. She's in the wilderness. She's alone. She's in hiding. She's broken. She's vulnerable. God meets her there, and he doesn't speak to a role. He speaks to a soul. And it's the first time in the story that her name is spoken. That's the tree of life. That's the wisdom of Jesus. That's Christ in you, the hope of glory. So, take a moment to practice imaginative prayer. Think of Jesus walking into the room, not to speak to your title, but to you, and simply ask, if I didn't have anything to prove, what would I want him to say? And then open up a book, even you non-journal types, and write it down. You need to allow that echo of your soul to be brought in front of you. And then finally, you can read these notes. Neurological disconnection. I know this doesn't apply to everyone, but for those of us who suffer from ADHD or neurotypical challenges or PTSD, this becomes very important that you learn to marry your spirituality and your physicality through grounding techniques. And you can read about those there in your notes. We need to come to a close. Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. This wasn't a command, it was a reality. The voice of the shepherd is not a theological concept, it is a relational experience. It's always rooted in love. You don't have to become someone else, someone better in order to hear it. You just have to become quiet enough to trust that it's already speaking in mercy, in tenderness, and in truth. So, this week, slow down, make space for silence. Notice how the voice that you're listening to makes you feel. Love leads you lighter, not heavier. Ask, does this voice know me or is it trying to manage me? This is very critical in the day of pragmatic spirituality so that we can become more successful in life. Does the voice know me or is it trying to manage me? And keep coming back to the shepherd, not to the system, not to the stranger, but to him. And remember that this passage ends with kind of this ominous tone. They did not understand what he was telling them. And the truth is, maybe some of us don't either. Part of this journey meant walking through seasons where I really did not understand this at all. Not saying I do now, it's just a little more clear than it was. But even in our lack of understanding, he keeps speaking. And when we're ready, when the noise fades, we'll hear it again. A voice that doesn't demand, a voice that calls us by our name, and a voice that leads us home. The worship team's going to come up, and we're going to take common communion, which means we do it a little bit different than we do our other weeks. When you come up to receive